Thank you, Famita. Thank you, Armine, Deena, Garima, and to the community of people who are tuning in to us today via Zoom. My name is Karim Bardeesy. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of the Ryerson Leadership Lab. And this is the next in our series of online Zoom video meetings and Q&As to try to connect people with policy knowledge and people who are on the front lines of some of the main issues affecting us in this current crisis with the broader community, and hopefully providing some intelligence, some insights, and a bit of a platform for action. We're doing these a few times a week, generally at 4 p.m., and really appreciate your participation in it. Before we begin, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement. Different people are in different traditional and indigenous territories. So I won't be able to capture everybody's location. We do this as a symbolic restorative act, one among many to follow, and part of a wider and hopefully transformative reconciliation project here at Ryerson. Ryerson, and where many of us are currently situated, is on the territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat. It's covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. And at the Faculty of Arts, where I spend some of my time, we're committed to honoring our obligations to these nations' treaties and to justice for Indigenous peoples generally. We have a lot of work to do in this particular regard with this particular crisis. And I hope that we can do that in the days, weeks, and months ahead. The Ryerson Leadership Lab with the Brookfield Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship and Matthew Mendelson at Ryerson are launching an initiative called Policy Response, which is intended to bring some of the best ideas forward to help respond to this crisis. And it'll be really important for us to do proactive outreach to people who are connected to and intelligent about various policy matters that affect Indigenous peoples and communities, while respecting their need and their desire to have a space of their own to have those conversations as well. So that's a bit about some of the work ahead in this multifaceted crisis. I hope that this conversation also creates some room for hope and people who are really pointed on some policy issues have been spending time looking at what workers and students and frankly the majority of the population in Canada that lives on some form of economic margin, that we can use this conversation to really point at the direction that where we need to go in terms of the economic and social policy response to the COVID-19 crisis. And I'm so happy that we have with us three really intelligent, excellent representatives from three very strong organizations that have been doing this work. Armine Yalnizyan, Atkinson Foundation Fellow on the Future of Workers, Garima Talwar Kapoor, Director of Policy Research in the Maytree Foundation, and Deena Ladd, Executive Director of the Workers Action Center. We're going to hear from them for about, first you're going to hear from Famita to set up some of the technical aspects of how we're going to run this. Then you're going to hear from Armine, Garima, and Deena, probably for about 5 minutes each. And then we'll have a moderated conversation and Q&A with me and Famita and our guests. We may pull in some others who have some special insights to bring to bear on that. We'll just ask that you show your video screen if you want and use the Zoom function to put up your hand if you're interested in adding an extra insight. But I know that on these webinars, we have had some great participation from people who are not the official panelists. And we'll do that moderated Q&A up to 5:30, and I believe that Armine and perhaps our other panelists may have to drop off before 5:30, but we will keep this conversation open and going until 5:30. And with that, I'll throw to Famita.
Awesome, thanks, Karim. So we have set up a Slido. So to access Slido, you just go to www.sli.do and enter the event code RLL2. That's RLL2 in all caps. What we're doing over on Slido is it's a great way for you to ask questions, pose questions to each of the panelists, including Karim. And then what others on the call can do is upvote the questions that are of most interest to them. And that's how we will prioritize the questions in this webinar. So if you want to go on to Slido right now, what we're doing is we are running a quick poll. So we are asking folks with relation to this conversation today, have you or someone you know lost their job due to COVID-19? So please help us gather some data and help us understand who is in the audience today and how this might be impacting you. If you have any questions, we are here to support you via the chat function. But we will be collecting all the questions on Slido to prioritize them and get folks to respond and let us know which questions are of most interest to them.
Thank you, Famida. And with that, and if you have any questions of a technical nature, please use the Zoom group chat. Otherwise, please use Slido to put a question and to nominate and to promote questions that you want others to answer. And with that, I think we'll start with Armine. Armine, you've been following the policy response from the federal and provincial governments, and you've seen some of the data already that kind of gives a sense of what's going on. So can you just help us, from your perspective, understand what's the economic situation that we're seeing in Canada, and what kinds of things are we going to see, and what are some of your recommendations? And I don't think we can hear Armine yet. So.
Hi, Armine, you're unmuted, so it should work. No, can't hear you yet. Are you using a microphone or just the computer audio?
No, not yet.
Let me try to see if I can mute and unmute from over here. Can you try again, Armine? No, still not working. Sorry, we can't hear you. Maybe if you leave the Zoom and try to come back in, it might reset something for you. Sorry about that.
Sure. Okay, and thanks, Armine. We'll have you back shortly. And in the meantime, we will maybe Garima, who spends a lot of time on social assistance policy, and Maytree, out of Maytree Foundation, very much focused on human rights approaches to some of our economic and social policy challenges. Maybe we can start with you and some of your initial perspectives and thoughts. And you have to unmute yourself as well.
Mute now. Okay. Is it working? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I am deeply humbled to be able to contribute to this discussion. When I started thinking about the question that was posed to us, it first required me to ask myself, well, what does fair actually mean? And so, like any policy person, I went to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, and according to this dictionary, a sense of fairness is marked by impartiality and honesty and free from self-interest, prejudice, or favoritism. And so when I think about the question, it implies that the current system that we had prior to COVID was not fair, and that a precise and concerted focus on fairness is required. Otherwise, will just perpetuate the cleavages and the injustices that our current system currently has. So it is riddled with unfairness. We have prejudices about why some people can make ends meet while others can or cannot. There is favoritism in our public policies around who gets ahead versus who does not. And all of this is undeniably true. And so when in the midst of this pandemic, I think that we often look to other jurisdictions to help find our policy solutions. This morning I was reading an article from the New York Times, and they basically had something that said, you got to put the V back into recovery. So as a fast decline should be mirrored by a fast recovery if you have the right policy proposals. And I just don't think that there is any policy tool that will actually do that. We're probably going to have a plateau, which means that lots of people are going to hurt for a really long time and be really be even more marginalized than they are now. And so during this period of economic contraction or slowdown, lots of people are saying that we got to move fast, and we have to think of policy solutions that move fast. But I do think that we need to slow down and ask ourselves, first of all, who are we prioritizing when we talk about policy solutions? And what does a fair economic recovery actually mean? And in my view, I think a fair economic recovery would first say that we want to prioritize and ensure that everybody in Canada has the right to live a life with dignity. And that is the opposite to what is happening right now. And so if we take a rights-based approach to a fair economic recovery, we'll actually prioritize those that have been left behind by traditional public policy instruments. That includes people who receive social assistance, for example. The federal government's first sort of phase of policy approaches, as it includes EI and those not in EI, still don't focus on people who may have never actually or may have not been part of the labor market for either a considerable period amount of time or a short period amount of time. And so if we think of a fair economic recovery, we're not just focusing on those that have lost their jobs or seen an incredibly reduced number of hours, and that's important to do, but we cannot forget those that have been living on welfare rates that are at about 30% of our poverty measure. And so systemic approaches that help to increase not only the rates that are provided to people receiving social assistance, or other changes like increases to asset tests, so people aren't depleting all of the savings and resources they have before they get their support, is important, so that you're not continuously marginalizing people that are already at the margins. We're seeing policy calls, right, or the federal government work with big banks for mortgage deferrals, which is a good thing again, but there is relative silence on what this means for renters. And if we're going to prioritize those that have been left behind, we not only need to think of rent freezes, for example, or think of ways in which people that are renting can actually afford to stay in the homes that they're in, but we also need to think about those that are inadequately housed in the first place. This includes people that are either homeless and street-involved homeless people, but also people that are invisibly homeless, and that's what we see in many of our suburban communities. And so a focused investment in housing will actually mean that people that are street-involved homeless actually have a safe place to call home, and aren't vectors of further transmission of this illness, but also can actually be well and not be sick. I think that there's going to be a lot about how you use the EI system and tax benefits and transfers to better support people. But we have to not forget that these programs don't capture everybody. And in our culture and our narrative, we often jump to support families. We jump to support people that are working, but we often forget those that are at the margins. And whether they are at the margins and working, we forget about those people as well. And so when we think about a first principle of fairness, I think a rights-based approach really helps in sort of prioritizing those that have been left behind, and also creates a basis or a new foundation for income security that we haven't seen in a really long time in our country. There's lots of, just before I stop my opening, there's many calls for a basic income right now, or a crisis basic income that we're seeing. And I think that, again, if we take some time to think about what the problem is, our problem is not the same as the United States. We've actually got a semblance of a welfare or social infrastructure that touches on a large majority of people that live in Canada. And so while the diagnosis of the problem and response to the problem in the United States maybe just ship out checks to people that might buy them a couple of weeks or months of time, we don't need to necessarily follow suit, because we actually have an architecture, a social architecture that we can strengthen and beef up, not only for a short-term response to COVID, but a longer-term response in the future.
Thanks, Garima. And just a quick note that the Slido platform is open and available for you to start contributing some questions and comments. And I have just wanted to note, and we're going to, I think, pull on the expertise of others in this call, and this video call, and I see joining us, this is not an exclusive list, but people I may ask to speak up at some point include Mike Jancic, formerly Premier's office, Senior Advisor to the Premier. I see Judy Rebick and Andrew Cash who have joined us. Diana Yoon, who can give us some perspective from a climate perspective, potentially. Some folks from the international development community. Jake Hirsch-Allen and John Meadow from a workforce development perspective. Anjum Sultana from a YWCA perspective. Janice Neal from a journalism perspective. So we've got a good representation of people on this, and I may pull you into this conversation as well to get your voices. Garima, just before, and I see Armine has joined us. And Armine, can you just say something just to see if can we hear you now? No, it's still.
Somebody needs to unmute me. Can you hear me now?
Oh, we got you. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Armine. I'll go to you next. But Garima, you mentioned a few things. I just want to follow up on. You mentioned a number of people who are not going to be captured by some of the existing programs. How many people are we talking about, and which levels of government are going to have to step up, and what is your prescription?
Yeah, I think so. I'd say that countrywide. If we talk about social assistance, let's just take social assistance. The ways in which social assistance is delivered is different across the country, and it varies based off of the provincial or territorial government and its own public policies and programs that it has. In 2018, again, there's very different ways in which one is eligible for social assistance in different provinces. But if we were to take together everybody that received some sort of social assistance in Canada in 2018, there were about 1.3 million cases. And that's individuals and families receiving social assistance, which is not a small amount of people. That it's not to say that they're not qualifying for EI or that they're not working. Many are, but this is a large segment of the population that is not going to benefit from the EI enhancement or the economic support benefit that the government announced last week. And while some of these families may benefit from a boost to the Canada Child Benefit, a majority of people that receive social assistance it continues to be single adults. And so again, once you start to segment the population that we're talking about, they're not going to benefit from a boost from the Canada Child Benefit. If they are tax filing, they may see a bit of a bump through the GST credit enhancement that the federal government announced. And so the pressure in terms of actually making policy changes that support those receiving social assistance falls on provincial and territorial governments. This does not mean, however, that the federal government doesn't have a role to play. The federal government provides transfers to provincial and territorial governments through the Canada Health Transfer and the Canada Social Transfer, for example. And we know from our own internal analysis that the amount of funding that the federal government has provided to provinces and territories through the Canada Social Transfer, which is used for programs like social assistance, has declined in proportion to the Canada Health Transfer, and has declined considerably in comparison to what it wanted its benchmark to be when it first created the program in 2003. And so I think that there is a significant role that the federal government can play to help support provinces and territories to bump up social assistance. So you do get at those 1.3 million cases that are currently receiving. And in the future, as we think of the economic shock that the pandemic is having, will lead to a larger number of people seeking support.
Thank you. Thank you, Garima. Okay, we've got Armine back now. And Armine, can you take us through your thoughts on where we're at and where we need to go?
Sure, I'll tell you where we're at. First of all, I think there's 4 areas in which people that don't have a lot of financial cushion for whatever reason are going to be supported and need to be supported. One is obviously through cash. The second is anything that reduces the payments that they have to make right now, that eases pressure on things that they can't control and they have no money for. So that would be housing costs, it would be debt, it would be student loans. And maybe meds, and maybe childcare, stuff like that. The third thing is actual shelter, particularly for people that can't self-isolate, like the homeless, or people that are overcrowded. And I'll get into that in a second. And lastly, for the not-for-profit sector, which may be municipal services, but it might be in the private sector through nonprofit agencies that are in constant interface with populations that most programs don't deal with. And on all of those fronts, we've got movement. I am shocked at how much movement we got at the federal level. I've been involved in trying to resist the changes that have happened to social programs since the late 80s. And in the early 90s, we saw programs that support working age adults eroded dramatically, as well as healthcare cutbacks, as well as cutbacks to education. And in the last 6-7 days, we've seen an entire redesign of the social architecture for Social Security. So yeah, it's not perfect, but we've seen more movement in a week than we've seen in decades of exactly the same conversations, because we knew exactly what was not, how the system was not capable of supporting people in a major recession. This is more than a major recession. And we are going to have to do way more than just income support. And Garima has mentioned some of those things, and Monty has mentioned the mental health side of it, which is incredibly important. And maybe we'll have time to discuss that a little bit more, but that's everything that we're talking about with social isolation and physical distancing, self-isolation and physical distancing, loss of income, and loss of connection leads to more anxiety and more distress and more mental health issues. So that is we know we're going to have a little bit of a bubble in terms of those things, and we'll need to deal with that as well. So when it comes to income supports, the federal government has put into place something, the best new thing that we know about right now is the emergency care benefit. It provides $450 a week, flat benefit, paid out every 2 weeks in a $900 check, and that will go out to 15 weeks. The way it's designed right now, guaranteed that'll be more money. It's essentially the first step in a basic income in a period where you just got to get cash out the door to people who are sick, people who are taking care of people who are sick, and people who are taking care of children because the schools are shut down. So those are the groups that get that benefit. I expect this week we will see something that looks kind of the same in the thing called the emergency support benefit, which was announced last week, but we didn't see any details on how it would work. And I imagine, I know that the federal government is looking at speed and cash to the people who need it most. And they're probably going to deliver it not through EI, which is overwhelmed right now with applications, but through the Canada Revenue Agency. On top of that, the Canada Revenue Agency will be tasked with distributing a supplemental one-time benefit. That's the way it's articulated now, but we know there will be more money coming. A one-time supplemental benefit to be distributed right now in May, but there's a lot of pressure for them to move it forward a little bit. Geez, I hope I remember these numbers right. I think it's $300 a head. And for, no, $300 a family per child for families that do receive CPD, $400 per individual that gets a GST credit, and if you're in a couple, $600. I imagine all of those amounts are going to go up because everybody's been talking about housing. The federal government can do very little about renters because it is a jurisdictional issue. In Ontario, where you live, the Ontario government has ended evictions. Anything that was already on the books will not be enforced. No new eviction orders will be permitted. So you're not going to lose your home because you can't pay your rent in this period. There will be other steps taken to, BC has got rent banks. The federal government is looking at ways they can support renters. The big thing they're doing is mortgage deferrals, and they're doing that through the banks. And the banks are intransigent to work with, let me say. But they have agreed to be able to make this announcement, though they have said it will be on a case-by-case basis. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of people that are going to continue working from home. They won't see a decline in their income. And so I think it's merited to say a case-by-case basis, except for the time that's involved there and the uncertainty for somebody that will go forward. But I think nobody wants the cascade of bankruptcies that this moment could put forward. So I'm moving to the debt repayment part of it. Oh, I've already gone over my time. Sorry, I'm at the 6-minute mark. Am I allowed to say anything about debt repayment or not?
Yes, go for it.
So the federal government has introduced measures to reduce, to defer interest on the Canada student loans. Then there's OSAP in Ontario. And already the Ontario government made some announcement, the BC government made some announcement today to defer payments on student loans at the provincial level. So again, because of our federation, there's certain things the feds can do. There's certain things that the provinces can do. Can I just say I'm really heartened by the tone of Ford Nation right now. In the two major pressers that he's given, he's really, I think, been quite pitch perfect. And I think he is open to being pushed, not to redesign the social assistance system, but to actually pay attention to the fact that the most vulnerable are the ones that are going to be the ones that bring the whole system down. And consequently, today they announced they were spending another $200 million. It might not be enough, but they're giving another $200 million to municipalities and not-for-profit services that work in the shelter sector, that work with very vulnerable populations and marginalized populations. More to come. We are not at the end of it, but we should be very strategic about how we ask for places that we think they're not even thinking about. And I can't actually, I can't think of anything they're not thinking about. Everybody is working nonstop to make this work, because for the first time in my adult life, I see all of our governments understanding that the health of each individual is tied to the health of us all. And this health crisis might actually be the culture shift we've been waiting for more than 2 generations. That
is a very helpful and hopeful note. And Deena, we're going to come to you next. but just one thing I wanted to pick up on, you mentioned the covering costs element, and you mentioned the moratorium on evictions. Are there other costs, major costs, that either governments or major institutions can choose to or can act to help alleviate now?
Yes, I do think that there are, for example, at the citywide level, but this would require concerted effort across the most stricken provinces, municipalities across the country. You could put a pause, you could press pause on property taxes. You could press pause on paying utilities, or at least not cutting off people that can't pay them. So there are other things we can do. So don't forget, this is not just a shock to the income side for people that are losing hours of paid work or losing their jobs entirely, but also a shock to not being able to pay for basics. So it's both an income side set of measures as well as an outflow set, like a payment stop. We just need to press pause on everything that isn't essential. And for the things that are essential, we need to say, okay, we'll press pause for, 10 days, for 2 weeks, because none of this money is going to flow through before April. But I think everybody gets that you can't ask to get blood from a stone. I think there will be some jerks, some examples of jerks out there, and we need to call them out. We need to socially shame them. But I don't think there's going to be like massive, well, there won't be evictions in Ontario, and I don't think you're going to get power turned off for people. So the job will be the not-for-profit sector to make sure people are getting food and meds without going out. We're going to need foot soldiers to be not just Uber and Lyft and Deliveroo, to be our supply chain.
Yeah, and there's no, to Garima's point and to your point, there's no national list of people who might have those kinds of needs. It really takes translation down to the institutions and the organizations closest to people. Yeah.
In my view, that's great. That's community building. I mean, we have these people in our communities that are the anchors of our communities, and we're calling on them to help build community because we know one another. It will take a village.
Thank you, Armine. And I recognize you may have to drop off at some point during this conversation. So thank you so much for that contribution. We'll come back to you in the Q&A. And again, we're looking to Slido for questions that you might want to put. And now with that, I'll hand it over to Deena Ladd, of the Executive Director and one of the co-founders of the Workers Action Center, from the perspective that you see, not only policy perspective, but a frontline perspective from the people you're trying to serve right now.
Yeah, hi everyone. I think that I have no words to explain in some ways the horrific impact that is being faced on the ground. We have been doing massive calls across the country with organizations that work with migrant workers, with farm workers, with live-in caregivers, with international students, as well as talking to our organizers on the ground who work in many different immigrant communities and work with undocumented workers. And I think it's really important for people to remember that obviously we've been experiencing in the last 20 years a massive increase in precarious employment. And so no big surprise, but many people in our communities have very little access to basic worker protection and income security benefits because of the way that they are hired through their employers. So we have lots of workers who are paid in cash, who are paid through subcontractors, who are misclassified as self-employed, who are not on the books, as they say, around employment insurance or even our tax system. And it's not through any fault of their own, but it's because of our immigration legislation that works hand in hand with our labor legislation to basically put people in an incredibly vulnerable situation. And so even before COVID-19, we were having a crisis in terms of the kinds of conditions that people were being subjected to in terms of employment, access to healthcare, access to basic income. And so, as you can imagine, the last I would say since the end of January, communities are in complete crisis. And so to me, provincially, I have to disagree with Armine. I absolutely think the Ford government has been awful in their response. We have been healthcare workers since mid to the end of January have been pushing the the Ford government on ensuring paid emergency leave days to get through this crisis. It is absolutely reprehensible that the Ford government has not come through with paid emergency leave days to get people through at least an initial crisis period, that they can have paid emergency leave days that are 100% of their income, that would carry them through while they wait for these emergency support measures to come through the federal government. We have had people from many different immigrant communities losing their jobs as of the beginning of February. And as you can imagine, in the last, I would say, 8 or 9 days, sort of a tornado of job loss. And awful situations such as live-in caregivers being forced to stay in isolation without being able to move out of their family's home, like literally forced captivity, farm workers coming in to work and having no food, no supplies, because none of the local towns have anything, in addition to undocumented workers basically being forced to do cleaning jobs with no health and safety equipment and not having any access to any support. And so I want to really emphasize that at the provincial level, it's not enough for the Ford government to push legislation to say no sick notes and emergency job protected unpaid leave. We need 21 emergency paid days right now. And that's what doctors and nurses and healthcare, community health people have been pushing for way before this became a pandemic. Federally, I think what's really critical for us right now is that immigration status and whether or not you are connected to the CRA through the tax system should not be a barrier to accessing the emergency support benefits or the emergency care benefits. We need to make sure that any initiative that happens starts with the bottom up, starts with the most vulnerable. And if they can't access those benefits, we will be in even more of a crisis situation, because it's those folks, it's the people that we're working with who are being forced to go to work and have no other option but to go to work, even if they are sick, because there is no access to these benefits. I don't know if you can get the sense of urgency from my voice, but I'm telling you, we are in such a crisis. We had 30 organizers from across the country yesterday in a teleconference call, where basically people are literally have no food and no access to income. And so if those federal benefits do not allow people to get them because of their immigration status, and because they've been paid cash by their employer, not because of their own choice, then we will face an even more healthcare crisis than we have right now. The other thing for those folks who are able to, who don't have immigration barriers and who are in the tax system, 600 hours to get access to EI makes it impossible for many low-wage, precariously employed workers. Now, you have to remember, we're coming out of a season, the winter season, where retail workers, food workers, already their hours dropped after New Year's, right? And so they will not have the hours needed to, and we know that they don't have the hours. They're calling us and telling us they don't have the hours. And the fact that the federal government only removed the 1 week waiting period for sick benefits, but not for regular benefits, and not for sick benefits for non-COVID-19 related health issues, I think was a shame, because at this moment, people need access to income. The other thing is, for a minimum wage worker in Ontario, we at least have $14. We need to make sure that the 55% of income, I mean, you're basically making people destitute. That's why low-income workers don't apply for EI, because 55% of $14 or $12 if you're in another province, you are not going to be able to pay your bills. The other thing I just wanted to mention, 2 more points, is that for federally regulated workers, it's also critical for them to have access to 21 emergency leave days. They are working in air transportation, in railways, bank tellers who are still working, and they are desperate for these days in case they get sick. The UK today announced that they will cover 80% of the salary of workers that companies can't afford to keep on. These are the kinds of initiatives that we need from our government. We need social services for all, where immigration status is not a problem. We need a moratorium on rent and mortgage payments. You know, it's not enough to put people in a situation where they have to individually hope for the best and keep their fingers crossed so that their bank manager or their landlord won't evict them or stop them from paying their mortgage. We know that low-income workers, working class people, are always at the bottom in these situations, and we're seeing this replicated again and again and again. And I know that it is really critical and that people are happy with the fact that the federal government has moved so quickly. But what I'm saying to you is that our communities have been in a crisis since the end of January, and we've seen very little movement. And we have been sounding the alarm since the end of January, and we have been ignored. And I think it's really quite critical that politicians and policymakers are paying attention to organizations that are on the front lines of workers who have very little access to anything. And I think it's really important. And you know, I have to say, the kind of damage that is being done by this pandemic in our communities right now is horrific. And I think policymakers, you know, we know historically that this might be precedent setting in terms of the initiatives, but it has to meet the needs of the most vulnerable. And you have to listen to the needs of, and you have to listen to the voices of people who are on the front lines. Otherwise you're missing the boat.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Deena, and a really good observation around people who might have a non-standard connection to their employer in the first place, or employers who pay them in cash or are asking them to do things, and those workers may not be in the position to dispute that at the best of times. I want to, before we move on, I just want to ask Andrew, I'll turn to Armine, but I want to ask after Armine, if Andrew Cash, you could speak to the artist perspective. I see you on there, and I think that would be a useful voice after we hear from Armine. So we'll hear from Armine to respond to some of Deena's comments and some of the more general things that have been said. Need to get you we just have to get you unmuted here. Yeah.
Does that work now?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's been some questions in the group chat, and whereas I completely agree with what Deena has said, that the Ford government has been intransigent on the paid sick days, I just want to reinforce that the provinces have been working with the federal government. The emergency care benefit goes to anybody, irrespective of what their status is, that is sick, that is caring for somebody that is sick, or is caring for a child that is in education. And we expect that the ESB will be doing the same. So far from just being 21 days of paid sick leave, it could be up to 14 weeks. Up to 15 weeks of $450 a week. So we are not talking, so yes, the Ford government is intransigent, no question about it. They've been creeps about all sorts of things. I've been so surprised by the tone of understanding what's happening from the bottom up and how that is a concern to everybody. However, just to reinforce that the province isn't the only one that can help out with paid sick days, that the federal package that was announced last Wednesday only, we know it's going to be expanded this Wednesday. They made it absolutely clear that they are working on ways to expand cash fast to people. So I want to address very quickly the EI threshold that Deena rightly raised, the feds know that the EI system isn't the way to get cash fast to people without enough hours. And they're not going to try and fix EI right now. They're going to try and get cash fast to people with not enough hours. And it'll happen through the tax system, which is why I said what I did initially. It'll happen through GST credits. It'll happen through CCB, Canada Child Benefits. It'll happen through the emergency care benefit. It will happen through the emergency support benefit. These are 4 programs that are going to be administered through the tax system that will reach more people than we've ever seen reached before without issues of how many hours did you work? Are you genuinely sick or not? What we don't know right now, they've heard it. I don't know what they're going to do about it. What do you do if you don't have hours? As Deena points out, if you're working for cash and you're undocumented, I think even if you're documented, you're fine, even if you don't have enough hours. But I don't know how they're going to deal with the undocumented group, and they know they need to deal with it. So that may not be resolved by this week, but they're working on it. I just want to reassure everybody that for the first time in my life working on public policy, I'm watching every level of government taking this seriously and understanding they need to boost they have to put a floor under the bottom, and they need to build resilience from the bottom up. That is what everybody on this call is trying to do. Katja said the province is looking at the big banks getting 6 months grace for mortgage payments, and Ford said nobody will be evicted. I said both things at the beginning. Ford has said nobody's evicted as of today. Nobody loses their housing because they can't pay it, but that's just in Ontario. It's not everywhere. And the second thing is, yes, the banks have agreed to defer mortgages up to 6 months, but on a case-by-case basis. As I said before, that might not be the worst thing in the world because there's still people working from home who can afford to pay their mortgages. And we do need some liquidity in the system. So those are all my comments. And I want to thank Deena and all of you on this line that do all the work to help boost and lift up our society from the bottom up. It's the only way it's going to work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Armine. And I see Peggy Nash has also joined, and former caucus mates in the federal parliament. And Peggy, I just asked before we get to the general Q&A, and please put your questions on the Slido platform. I just wanted to get a perspective from Andrew from kind of an artist perspective, not that you only speak for them, but that's a community that you're definitely connected to.
Okay, can you hear me then?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for putting this together. I think we've all, had the thought of how do we stay connected? How do we organize when people can't actually physically get together? So thank you so much for showing a way that we can still get connected like this. Armine has underlined, what I think is a crucial plank to the floor that has been missing for so long for anyone who's outside of the employer-employee relationship. And of course, in the cities like Toronto, we have a huge arts and culture sector and a huge service industry sector.
Yeah. And you should speak to the Urban Worker Project that you're involved in.
That's right, yeah. And oftentimes they are connected. There's you have someone who's working part-time at a restaurant who's also a musician and also making money as a web designer. And so 2 of those 3 jobs are outside of the employer-employee relationship, and the one that is inside it is woefully, the hours that a worker can show there are so woefully low that most people never think about applying for EI. Now, I did a piece for Maclean's the other day, and I did speak to a musician whose entire income just got pulled out, both her restaurant job and her music job, and she went to apply for EI thinking that she'd heard that there was a new system in place, so she went and applied, and they asked her for a T4, and the one that she had was, she might have been able to get a cup of coffee with that. So one of the challenges I think is we have a large cohort, a large population of workers who have been outside of the system for so long that they don't consider ever checking into it to see if there's anything for them, because generally there never is. And so I think part of the challenge going forward is, you know, and I mean, I have my fingers crossed that the federal government is not going to make this difficult for people, because if there's too much friction and too much frustration, it's going to be a problem. So I think one of the big challenges is letting workers know, letting you know, independent workers, that, you know, those that are outside of the employer-employee relationship, letting them know that this is actually happening and that it's for them. And I think that that's a, you know, it could potentially going forward be a turning point for this issue. And I just want to add, just parenthetically, I am concerned that the banks have the kind of like the leeway that they apparently have. And I understand your point, I mean, but I am concerned about that. I mean, historically, we know that that never really turns out all that great. And, you know, it is perplexing why it happened the way it happened. That is in the domain of the federal government, and perhaps we'll see something tighter, I don't know, but I just want to leave that out there as well.
Thanks, Andrew, and I'll make an editorial comment that I haven't actually seen anything that has changed the fundamental bottom lines of the banks at this point. Their interest rate cut is a pass-through, and they can do some mortgage deferrals, but doesn't seem to be, their bottom line doesn't seem to be affected as dramatically as so many other people's bottom lines. Mm-hmm. There's some great questions on Slido that we'll start going through, and you can also use the hand up function. Some of the folks that I mentioned at the beginning of the call, if you'd like to chime in, and we'll see if we can get to you as well.
Karim, I think Deena wants to say something. Her hand is up.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, Deena. Yeah, let's get Deena back if she can, because I see her hand up. And for all our panelists, Garima, Armine, and Deena, you can use the hand up function here, and I think she's coming back here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is that, you know, these issues that have been facing our communities have been facing them for decades. And so we know that in these times that are tough, that they're not necessarily the folks who are in precarious employment, the cleaners, the folks who do food service work, all the airport workers. I mean, these are the workers that that are invisible. And I think it's really quite critical that, you know, I'm not someone that kind of can have a lot of hope. I mean, I've listened to so many of these press conferences over the last week, and I'm heartened by Armine's positivity, and I guess, you know, seeing behind the scenes what's happening. It is not very clear to people in the community that the emergency care benefits are for undocumented people and for people whose status is precarious in this country. It's not very clear in any of the information that's being given out that the support benefits will be for those folks who are not in the tax system, and again, who are undocumented. And so we have thousands and thousands and thousands of workers who are mainly racialized and who are basically have no other supports. They don't have access to social assistance. They don't have access to EI. They don't have anything else, and they're at the mercy of their employer at this particular moment. We also, I think it's really important to say that one of the biggest calls that we're getting on our hotline are workers being put in a situation where they're trying to refuse to work because they're being asked to clean buildings, and they're being asked to forcibly be confined in people's homes to take care of their children and not being allowed to leave. And they have no other options at this moment. So, you know, at these moments, you're seeing absolutely lovely things that people are doing, but you're also seeing the worst of things. And I think that what we need to do and what the government needs to do is start from the basis of protecting people who are the most vulnerable. And so therefore it means that a case-by-case basis at a bank in terms of stopping mortgage payments, or a case-by-case basis with a landlord around rent, is not going to work for those who are vulnerable, because they're in rooming houses. They're in housing situations that are untenable even at the best of times. And so I think what I'm trying to say here is that we haven't been seeing anything in the announcements that actually are covering the concerns that communities that are already peripheral, but who have been made peripheral by our labor laws and by our immigration legislation, that there is nothing coming out that is actually acknowledging that. So I think that that is really quite critical. I also think that as this money goes to social services and for these, you know, making sure that people have access and they don't put eligibility requirements regarding immigration status is critical right now.
Okay, thank you so much, Deena. We're going to get some of the questions from the Slido channel now, and maybe I'll take one that's a bit lowered. Let me take the top one in response to the original framing of this conversation. Is fairness the thing we're after in an economic deal? Would it be better framed through a lens of universal dignity or thriving or well-being? And Garima got a bit at that. What can we hope to achieve at the most broad level as the response? If it's, what words would you use, and what are the kind of priorities? Okay, I think we're going to hear from Garima. She's trying to.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
I think that what we can hope for optimistically is a modernized and revised social architecture system that is enduring and isn't set up to respond to our current crisis, but you know, learns from the lessons that we know have existed for decades. We've known about the shortcomings of our system for decades, and we use this crisis to talk about rights, to talk about dignity, to talk about fairness in a way that looks at people as people and not as some being deserving and others being undeserving. And I think that we actually do have, I think culture plays a large part to how welfare systems or social architecture is developed. And I do think that in the Canadian context, we might have an opportunity to shift the narrative a little bit, but that's only if we are alert to the narratives that are coming out from other parts of the world, including our neighbors south of the border, in terms of how we respond to this crisis. So I would think of rights, fairness, and dignity being at the top of my list.
Thank you, Garima. I'm going to move on to just in the interest of time, try to get as many questions in as possible. Armine got a bit at this, but John Meadow, who has a lot of knowledge around a lot of related issues here. What do we know about the $5 billion emergency support benefit? When will it start? How do people get it? And will it top up the kinds of workers that that Deena was talking about, who may not have much income to begin with, and therefore their EI entitlement would be especially low? Yes, yeah, if you can.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. We don't know. They're in the process of designing it. They're designing something on the fly. They know they need to reach out to people that are not EI eligible. They know that even if they use tax forms for GST and CCB, it might not be good enough because people's incomes will have collapsed between what happened the last time they filed, which was for 2018. Most people haven't filed for 2019. So there's a lot of policy design problems to get this thing on the road. We know we will not see it. We will not even see an application form before April. So there is this window that people are left high and dry, which is why I said earlier, we're going to need to socially shame any company or utility or government that demands payment in this window. Everybody has to just chill until income starts flowing again. Because there's so many people, as the CCPA report that came out this morning that said amongst renters, and there's over 3 million renting households, half of them don't have enough money to pay the bills beyond 1 month, and a third of all renting households have only got 2 weeks spare. So we know we're in trouble, and the designers of the program know they're in trouble, and it is being designed, and we have brought forward all sorts of issues like, what are you going to do if somebody doesn't have immigration papers, doesn't have taxes, tax forms, relevant tax forms, and is not EI eligible? And they know they have to tick off all of those boxes. How they do it, I don't know. And also remember that once we do it the first time, just like they announced something last week, the emergency care benefit is for $10 billion. The emergency support benefit is earmarked right now at $5 billion. It'll be many multiples of the emergency care benefit when we're done with this, but we're nowhere near done. So as the federal government has said, whatever it takes is what we're going to do. And our job is to keep their feet to the fire so that they're protecting the most vulnerable as they design this. I just want to say it will not be perfect, and it will not be finished. This is a work in progress, and we need to keep pushing hard. And thank you, Karim, and the people at Ryerson for organizing this so that we can keep having these dialogues to say, push here now to make sure. And Deena's voice is the most eloquent and loud voice on this front about who's being left out, who has always been left out. So let me just say, even though we are doing the best we can to move these issues into the mainstream of thinking in the design, which is not yet finished, I hope we hear something this Wednesday, but we might not. But certainly they're working around the clock to design something that works. It's pointless to announce something that cannot work, that disappoints everybody, and that cannot be made operational because we know the EI system is about to crash, and we can't announce something else that is about to crash. We can't have the phoenixization of income security in the middle of the pandemic. So they are looking at how they bring this thing to hit the highway at 100 clicks an hour. That said, I think it will be challenging to get it to serve all the needs that everybody is talking about, particularly for the undocumented workers. And I want to remind us why it matters that this works for as many people as possible. There are 6 million people on the front lines of the sectors that just got shut down. There are 2 million self-employed workers that are working for themselves. They don't have any workers. There are 2 million workers that are working temporary jobs right now, and a third of all young people have got temporary jobs, and that's just official statistics. This doesn't reach out to the people that Deena has been talking about, who are undocumented, who are working under the table. But there are millions upon millions of people that we need to help, that can be helped. And if we don't have that immediately in place, the whole system's going to collapse and goddamn fast, and we will need to start working through all of our systems, not just the federal transfer payments, not just the provinces, and not just the charitable sector and the not-for-profit agencies. We all have to do something to protect the most vulnerable and encourage them to come forward and ask for help.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Armine. John, you put the question before I move on to the next person. You've been in government, you've helped design programs. Do you any other comments on what you've heard?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks a lot for that, Armine. I mean, for me, the big question is just how all of these different benefits are going to interact with one another. And as you've put it, we just don't know yet. I have lots of questions about whether someone is hoping to get EI and applies through that system. If the result is that they don't qualify or they get very low benefits, is it going to be all linked up so that they get a top up, or are they going to have to start all over again in another queue? How does it interact with provincial social assistance systems? Just a load of questions that all kind of almost put at hyperspeed a bunch of the rationale behind maybe universal basic income around just the kind of complexity around interaction of benefits that could really accelerate quite quickly with this. So watching it very closely, but thanks a lot for your response there.
Thank you.
Can I say something about, can I just say something about UBI? First of all, I think the government has tried to target stuff so things can be stackable. So really vulnerable populations, like households with very low income, with children, with dependents, and with care people, they can stack those benefits, because none of them are really big. The problem with the UBI is like a flat benefit, and right now the UBI that's being suggested is $450. If you're an unemployed worker that has had a job for a long time, you get more on EI, but the money will come through faster with this emergency care benefit and ultimately with the emergency support benefit. So the issue is really, really important. The stackability is really important. They're aware of it. They've even announced some stackability. They did say last week that a family could get both GST credits as well as $300 per kid, and plus the emergency care benefit, and end up with more than $1,500 a month. So there's, sorry, way more than $1,500 a month, but like the stackability is really important, and that's why one single form might not be great, because if we are all in agreement that we need to boost the most vulnerable the most, $450 a week is not going to cut it. You know, they're going to need more help. So we're looking at ways we can stack help.
Okay, thank you so much, Armine. Next, I'm going to jump, because it's related to the cost equation, and again, these benefits that might not be just as accessible as they need to be on a time that's needed. And so I'm going to jump to Brittany's question, and I don't know if this is Brittany from Broadband Institute. If so, great. If not, that's great too. Is the way we put a pause on bills important? Does it matter which ones occur, or is the intent just to halt the need to make payments in general? So that's a really important and good question about how widespread you can help people from making expenses. And so Brittany, if you have any color to add on that, we'll get our panelists to take a shot at that. And then Brittany, if you want to say anything.
Do you want me to start off?
Yes.
So you can hear me. Okay. So the really important thing about relieving payments that are big or non-discretionary, of all of them, housing is the biggest. In anybody's budget, rich or poor, shelter costs are the biggest bite out of your budget. And what we have just learned, at least for the most vulnerable, is nobody will get evicted. And so that's the ultimate deferring of payment if you can't afford to pay. The next part is utilities, right? Heat, light, electricity. I would say let's throw in telecom, because they actually placed a moratorium on overages for data usage, but they could actually say we'll defer payments for a while, but I doubt we'll see that. And then the next bit is transit. Cities could be making transit such as it exists. Even though we're all being told to stay at home, we could have cheaper transit. And of course, there's property taxes for low-income homeowners that have lost their income, in addition to whatever mortgage deferral. I want to go back to the mortgage deferral thing, because even though it looks discretionary, and that's always a problem, as Andrew pointed out, that things that never ended up terribly well when we rely on the banks to do the right thing, it still is important to have some leeway, because you don't want people that are working and have seen no reduction in income stop paying their mortgages, because we need some cash flow in the system. And so I think here's a question where this is a leap of faith. I completely agree with you, Andrew, that this isn't the most happy-making moment, but it's a leap of faith. So anything to do with utilities, anything to do with property taxes, anything to do with even credit card payments, just don't shut down access to credit right now because you haven't paid your minimum payment. And I think there's a lot of understanding that if the system shuts out too many people, everything falls apart.
Yeah.
And so I think that awareness will encourage better corporate behavior. Whether it's good enough, I don't know.
Okay. Thank you, Armine. And hopefully that'll avert one of the questions that comes up, that came up in the Slido around rent strikes, although they're a related policy issue there for sure. I'll add one other major spending item in a lot of people's worlds, especially in rural Canada, which is auto insurance. And we have not heard anything about auto insurance from any government. And there does exist some form of directive power in provincial insurance acts, at least in Ontario, to make quite sweeping policy statements. And I'm curious about what will happen there with respect to that sector, although they're going to be hurt by lower interest rates. I'm going to go to the next question, and then at some point soon I want to line up Peggy, because one sector we haven't really talked about yet is the union movement and what their relationship to some of this is, although is implicit in some of the things that have been said. But I just want to get maybe a bit of a union movement perspective from Peggy and the union management relationship from Peggy Nash, who is the chair of the advisory board of the Center for Labor Management Relations at Ryerson, and a former senior official at Unifor and a former senior MP. So next question from Rahul, and we got a bit of this answered today, but charitable and NGOs are not getting attention, but they're significant economic contributors. What are the consequences of leaving them out? And I think this is in reference to the federal sector, federal sector and small business initiatives that initially seem to leave charities and NGOs out. There was another question related to the oil and gas sector that could be getting a bailout. So charities and NGOs, do they need direct support beyond the support for their employees that's been referred to earlier? Maybe Garima, do you want to take that? Yeah, or Armine, yeah, go ahead. Or Deena, yeah.
Sorry, today Ontario announced that they are going to give direct support. The feds did leave. The only reference to the NGO sector last week was access to credit, but NGOs don't access credit the same way that small businesses do. So and NGOs were folded, and they know they need to be working with the provinces and territories on the NGO sector, and they are starting to do something about it for what it's worth.
Okay, Deena, do you want to say something on this?
Okay, hi. Yes, I mean, I think that what's really quite critical is that, you know, the NGO sector is on the front lines of working with communities that they have relationships with. And I think in some ways, this pandemic has shown has exposed the sort of lack of, well, the sort of cutting of public services. So for instance, for many of us trying to access income security benefits and accessing sort of major supports for people that we're working with, that like you're literally on hold for an hour or 2 hours and you can't get access to anyone. And so I think the thing is that what we're seeing is a crisis in public services. And I think from a union perspective, I think the kinds of drastic cuts that were made during the Harper years, the freezing of public sector workers since the Ford government came into power, has doubly meant that nonprofits are under immense strain right now to support people. And we ourselves, I work for a nonprofit, we ourselves receive no government funding from the province or the feds. We receive a little bit of City of Toronto funding, which has been, gradually eroding. And so, you know, in terms of like, if people can't get through for basic issues such as the right to refuse work or accessing employment insurance, or what do I do around a violent situation, domestic violence situation, or, you know, I'm losing my housing. These are all services that have been like absolutely drastically cut. I'd like to remind people about the massive cuts to legal aid that happened last year. $33 million was cut. So all of those services that our communities rely on, they can't get access to any supports. All the community legal workers were all laid off, right? So we desperately need an injection of funds, but we need to also make sure that the federal government and the provincial government don't put unnecessary barriers to people accessing them. Because one of the biggest things we've also seen is that they're compartmentalizing who can access what service, again, depending on immigration status. And I think at this particular moment, we need to be able to say all social services should be available to anyone. There should be a don't ask, don't tell policy. Toronto is a sanctuary city, but many cities aren't and many provinces aren't. But at this particular moment where people are dealing with like essential crises every single day, we need to make sure that there is a massive injection, but that the message going down to the NGO sector is that they are responsible for all the people in their community and not just for those who have citizenship. And I think that is really critical right now.
Thank you. Let's keep on going with questions here. Oh, sorry, Peggy, I wanted to get your voice, if you could, just on union movements involvement in this. Oh, and before I get to that, just on the group chat, Anjum Sultana's referred to the call for a sector stabilization fund for the NGO sector. And you can continue looking at that chat channel. There's been some folks who are putting in calls to action and campaigns and efforts they're involved in, or Hannah Renglich from the Canadian Community Economic Development Network is referring to their involvement in these issues. So you can continue to use the chat channel for calls to action. We'll keep it open until, we'll keep this all open until 6 o'clock, even though this webinar ends at 5:30, but we'll keep the chat channel open until 6. Peggy, do you have any perspectives that you can help, things you want to respond to here?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for organizing this. Secondly, I'm so sorry that I had to come late, but I think the first thing is that the labor movement, from what I understand, is scrambling like everybody is scrambling. And it is a mixture of those who are facing a real cliff of unemployment. I spoke to a senior person in Unifor who said that they might be facing up to 70% of their members on layoff. So that would be a calamity for them. But on the other hand, there are groups of workers, obviously, who have too much work, and healthcare workers, long-term care workers, some drivers, delivery people, food service workers, retail workers in grocery stores. So for those workers, I think occupational health and safety is key. We've heard the nurses call for some time around the N95 masks, and a real concern about ensuring there's enough personal protective equipment as well as effective equipment for patients. So I think there's this mix of realities that the labor movement's facing. I think for the senior people in the labor movement, I think through the CLC, there is direct contact with the federal government in trying to shape the programs that are being offered. But just a couple of other quick points. I think there is also concern for unemployed in unemployed sectors, although some are being retooled for essential needs, hand sanitizer, etc. I think there's also a concern that businesses may take this opportunity to retool or shut down in a way that they've been wanting to, but it has been difficult outside of a crisis to do that. So I think there's a real sense of vulnerability in a number of industries. And what hasn't always happened in the past, and I think could happen because of the depth of this crisis, or ought to happen, is a coming together of the people who are newly feeling vulnerable during this crisis and those who have always felt vulnerable or marginal. And I think there is an opportunity for a kind of social solidarity that maybe has not been as strong as it should have been through the labor movement. I don't know if that is happening or going to happen, but I think the times give it an opportunity to happen, and the strength of the labor movement, such as it is, could really be put to a broad societal use that I think it needs to play more of.
And it will take some leadership for that to happen in a time when everyone is still authoring what is happening.
Yes, sure.
There's one, I just wanted to pull for one question from the Slido. A question around deferrals. This is from Anonymous. Why are deferrals considered helpful? Payments are deferred, still means we have to pay later. And this also speaks to the economic reconstruction project that we will have to do, that includes the social architecture being reconstructed or based on what we've just built in the last week. So projecting ahead a bit, and this is really projecting ahead after the stay home instructions enforced by law or public security forces are reduced. What does the economy after look like, and how do we help people who they're definitely worse off, but they're also no better off, and so the things that are coming their way are still going to come their way?
Do you want me to address that?
Sure.
So we don't know what's going to happen later because it depends on how sick people get now. And the number one thing that is going to define the economy after all of this is over is how many people get sick and how many people die now. And we don't know how we're going to behave to both shorten the period of the ultimate period, because, you know, the whole point of having people stay at home is to lengthen the period of infection, so we slow down the rate of infection so our systems don't get overwhelmed. We don't know how long that process is going to be. We don't know how many people will ultimately get infected, and we don't know how many people will die. So what the economic system is going to be like on the other side is like asking for a sci-fi novel to be written now. And there are such novels, if you like these type of things. There's Lionel Shriver's The Mandibles, which is eerily prescient. But right now, the issue is getting help to people. To number one, help people that are sick or think they're sick or are taking care of the sick or taking care of kids to stay at home. That is the number one thing. That's why we keep focusing not on deferring payment, making sure people that don't have enough cash don't feel obliged to run out there and get money to pay for bills. If we could just press pause on the bills, as well as, you know, if for the people that lose their income, then we're making the most vulnerable people feel stronger about staying at home. Because even if we don't get paid sick days into their pocket by the end of the month, and we probably won't, then they know that the dogs aren't at the door.
Yeah.
So that's why we keep talking about deferral. The question is excellent about what happens after it's deferred, but we are so far away from answering that question now that that's immaterial right now. We just have to keep people at home.
Okay, Deena, I think, had her hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Armine that I think that it's hard to imagine sort of what things are going to look like at the end of this. I mean, I'm a parent, and so I'm also in touch with my family in England, where they're saying the children aren't going to go back to school until September. And so what that means for people who are working and who are parents, and for our children, and for all of the people that we're working with, it's hard to imagine that. But so I do think that absolutely, I think that the critical thing right now is that it will be okay if we, as I think Armine said, you know, it'll depend on how many people die. And I think, you know, part of that is also then what are our benefits, and what are, you know, and I think that's what she was, you know, that she was also talking about, is that how we take care of people now depends on what the economy looks like then. And I think that is really critical, which is why I have this sense of urgency in terms of seeing all of these people that I'm working with, and all of these groups across the country that are falling through the cracks right now. And it's just been like 7 days. But I mean, obviously we've been dealing with this, as I said before, like beginning of February. But I think what I want to remind people is that there are many low-wage workers right now who are doing essential work. They're the truckers, the drivers, they're the personal support workers, they're working in long-term care, they're the grocery store workers, they're the cleaners. They need paid personal emergency leave days. So if they get sick, they can take 2 days off and they can actually recover and not be in quarantine, right? Because these are essential services that we're down to. So if federally regulated workers and if provincial workers who are essential service workers don't have access to fully paid and job protected emergency leave, they're also in an incredibly vulnerable situation, because we are dealing with, you know, at the Workers Action Center, we're either dealing with workers who have completely lost their jobs and have nothing, or are dealing with massive job intensification and are being asked to do more for less, not receiving the hours, not receiving more pay, and are, you know, in some situations I'm hearing of things where workers in warehouses, logistics warehouses, are trying to keep their workplaces safe and clean, but they're being reprimanded because they're not being asked, they're not working fast enough. So, I mean, these are the situations, these are the stories that we're hearing from non-unionized workers, but who are doing essential services right now, and they need job protected emergency leave days. I mean, it's really quite critical for them, because otherwise they're going to want to not go to work and not provide these essential services. And so people need a bit of a safety net, that's all.
Thank you, Deena. I'm going to ask Famita, we've got a couple minutes left to put up the next poll, just to get a sense of who's participated in this, and I'm going to call on one more question. We just want to get a sense of who's participating in this webinar today. I'm going to call on one more question. I'm going to also remind us that Brookfield Institute, Ryerson Leadership Lab, and Matthew Mendelsohn have started an initiative called Policy Response. It's going to be pulling together, hopefully, a number of organizations and policymakers to help provide actionable advice on the path ahead. And so watch for that. And the poll is up right now in terms of what sector you work in. And the last question I'm going to pose before we wrap up, and then I want to queue up Mike Jancic and Jay Kirsch-Allen, who are smart about things in the future, if they can stay a bit past 5:30 to give some of their prognostications. But one important question that we need to ask is, and this again from Anonymous, what is a fair economic deal for Indigenous peoples on the reservation in resistance during this pandemic? How do we push our governments to hear their needs? Really important question, and don't know if anyone has the answers there, but want to make sure that we get your the feedback from some of the panelists on that question. And a reminder to participate in our poll by visiting www.sli.do and entering the event code RLL2 as we do that poll. Anyone want to take on that question about what a fair deal looks like for Indigenous communities and how their voices can be heard at this time?
I'll be quite brief. I am not in any way an expert in any of this, but I think what this pandemic is revealing to us is the importance of collective action and the role of government in our everyday life. For decades, we really questioned that. And this pandemic, I think the lasting effects of it will be our collective understanding of the role that government really does have to play. In that, I think that in Canada, we have to simultaneously have a conversation around what does a decolonized government actually look like, and what does decolonized governance actually look like. And I am in no way, shape, or form the person to be able to answer that question. But I do think that for people like myself that think about public policy questions in the future of collective action in government, we need to keep that top of mind. And that's where I'll leave that.
Thanks. Let me, I see Mike has unmuted his video, so I think he might, Mike Jancic, policy consultant and former senior official in the Ontario Ministry of Education, as well as a senior advisor to Premier of Ontario and the Treasury Board Minister. Mike, do you want to just share a couple of perspectives? We're at 5:30 now, so I want to get your perspectives on the path forward, and then I'll wrap it up.
Hi. So I don't know that I have a lot to add. I think this was a great conversation. The thing that I see is only that there is an opportunity, I think, maybe for a shift where as we get to the other end of this, there may be an opportunity to focus more on dignity and well-being. And I guess what I mean is that I think there may be a moment where inequality is less acceptable. But I've enjoyed listening to the conversation very much.
Thank you, Mike. I think we've really helpful words to part with. Armine has texted in the chat because she has had to go. La lutte continue, or la lutte continue. Grateful to work in this community with you, but gotta fly. And we're appreciative to Armine for spending some time. Obviously, she's connected to the policymakers that are working on this federally and provincially. And we're going to keep this conversation, this meeting open for another half hour, where people who are participating can be in conversation and or on chat. Thank you so much to Garima, to Deena, to Armine, to Colette Murphy from the Atkinson Foundation, and from Elizabeth McIsaac from the Maytree Foundation, to the Ryerson Leadership Lab team, Famida Kamali, Braylon Guppy, and Inez Donoso. And to all of you for being a part of this community. Once again, our policy response initiative is launching, and we are looking to bring in others, including, as you can see, my daughter behind me, into this work. And thank you so much for participating.
Pick up a house. Daddy, can you pick up a house? Can you pick up a house? Can you pick up a house?
That's hard, but maybe.
No, like an entire house. This
I can't, but really strong people can. So we'll keep this open, and we'll keep the chat channel open. Thanks so much to all of you. And we'll be doing these on occasional Mondays, Wednesdays, or Fridays at 4 p.m. And stay tuned for the next one. Thank you so much.
Thank you.